Washington, D.C., autumn of 1971. The city was wrapped in an overcast hush, the kind of silence that settled not from peace, but from the weight of unspoken things. The stone streets near Arlington National Cemetery were damp from morning rain, the air tinged with the scent of wet leaves, tobacco, and the fading trace of gun oil that still lingered in the old uniforms of passing veterans. Among them walked John Koslow, a man whose name had long since faded from press releases and parades, but whose footsteps still carried the rhythm of battle. He wore his original World War II U.S. Army uniform, the olive drab slightly faded, the stitching along the shoulders worn thin. On his chest, tarnished but present, the bronze star, and inside his breast pocket a folded letter, yellowed, fragile, but protected all these years like a living thing. It was written by the man whose funeral was taking place that very morning. General William Nowak, a commander John had once served under, a man whose voice still echoed in his memories like the sound of artillery in a distant field. But John wasn't there for recognition. He wasn't attending out of nostalgia or pride. He came for something else entirely, a promise made in the middle of war, sealed in mud and blood and fear, and never fulfilled. As he reached the steps of the old post chapel, the ceremonial heart of Arlington, he was stopped by two military guards, young, clean-cut, their uniforms pressed with a crispness that said they'd never slept in a foxhole or stared down death with nothing but grit in their gut. One held a clipboard, the other a pair of eyes trained more on regulation than on recognition. "Sir, I'm gonna need to see your invitation," the guard said, tone neutral but firm. John reached slowly into his inside pocket and pulled out a wrinkled ID card, issued decades ago by the Army's Veterans Affairs Division. The guard barely glanced at it. "I'm sorry, sir, this is a private military service. Guests must be on the list." He stood there, his fingers tightening around the letter in his pocket. He had no name tag, no Medal of Honor to flash, no official status to lean on. Around him, polished shoes tapped up the stone stairs. Senators, generals, dignitaries. Men who'd served on paper, men who'd left the war on schedule. But John had never really left. From the sidewalk, a few guests gave him passing looks, some curious, others dismissive. To them, he was just an old man clinging to a memory, a relic maybe, not a soldier, not a brother in arms. And then, across the crowd, a face turned toward him, a woman. Her coat was navy blue, her hat simple, her eyes locked on his, like they hadn't in over 25 years. Her name was Sophie, and the moment John saw her, the weight of the years collapsed into a single breath. He wasn't sure if she'd speak, or if she even wanted to, but she was here. And John hadn't come for medals or speeches. He had come for the truth. A truth folded between brittle pages, written in a dead man's hand. If this story is already touching you the way it touched me while writing it, give it a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep sharing stories that inspire, move, and surprise. And now, get ready, because what happens next will change everything. The autumn air in Washington, D.C. had a certain weight to it, not the oppressive humidity of a southern summer, but a quieter, heavier stillness, the kind that settles in late October when the leaves have mostly turned and begun to fall, and the sky hangs low like a tired eyelid, casting long, faded shadows across the avenues of stone and memory that wind through the capital's heart. For John Koslow, walking alone past the National Mall, past the quiet fountains and marble monuments, each step on the damp pavement echoed not only in the streets around him, but somewhere deep within, a place where the war still breathed, where his youth still marched, and where a promise made in the dirt and smoke of Europe had never stopped whispering. He wore the uniform he had kept folded in cedar for nearly 3 decades, a U.S. Army wool service coat from the Second World War, the seams slightly thinned with age, the color faded from olive to the dull green of distant things. On his chest, above his heart, the bronze star rested, tarnished by time and moisture, but polished gently that morning, as if to remind himself it was real, that he had once been the man others saluted, the man who returned fire and carried the wounded, the man who had stood beside General William Nowak, whose funeral was taking place that morning at Arlington National Cemetery. But the medal wasn't what he came to bring. Not today. Tucked deep in his left breast pocket, wrapped in a small piece of oilcloth and bound with a string he had tied himself all those years ago, was a letter, a piece of paper no more than a few inches across, yet heavy with the words of a man who had been larger than life and whose voice still followed John in dreams and quiet moments. The general had written it one night in 1944 after a skirmish that left 2 men dead and John with shrapnel in his shoulder and a silence in his chest that never fully healed. He remembered how Nowak handed it to him, not as a command, not even as a request, but as a confession wrapped in orders, sealed with trust. "If anything happens to me," Nowak had said, his voice low but steady in the cold night air, "you'll know when it's time." And now, it was time. John's boots hit the stone walkways of Arlington with the slow, steady rhythm of a man both reluctant and resolved. He passed by rows upon rows of headstones, their perfect symmetry a quiet testimony to sacrifice, to silence, to the weight of memory that this country often bore without quite knowing how. He didn't stop, didn't search for names he knew. He couldn't. Not today. Today was about one grave, one man, one letter that had waited too long. As the old post chapel came into view, white stone and Gothic arches framed by turning oaks, John saw the first signs of ceremony. Black cars idling near the path, officers in full-dress uniforms standing at attention, reporters huddled behind velvet ropes waiting for statements they didn't understand. He slowed as he approached the steps, already knowing what would come next, but walking forward anyway, because if he didn't try now, he never would. 2 uniformed guards stepped into his path. They were young, barely more than boys, but stood with the hardened posture of men taught that dignity and authority were to be worn as tightly as their pressed jackets. One of them, a tall black soldier with the polished composure of someone who had studied protocol more than combat, raised his hand politely but firmly. "Sir, I'm going to need to see an invitation." John reached inside his jacket slowly, not to argue, not to provoke, but because he wanted to show them not who he was, but that he had a reason to be there. He pulled out a worn veteran's ID issued decades ago, the plastic slightly warped, the photograph barely legible. The second guard, a red-haired private with freckles and uncertainty behind the eyes, glanced at it, then back at the older man in front of him. His expression shifted, not quite dismissive, but not compassionate either. "I'm sorry, sir," he said. "This is a private military service. Attendance by invitation only." John nodded once, his jaw tightening, not from anger, but because something about the moment, the refusal, the familiarity of it, struck a chord he hadn't expected. He'd been told no in 1,000 ways over the years. By time, by silence, by a government that never knew what to do with men like him after the fighting was done. This wasn't new, but it still hurt. He stepped back. The crowd moved around him like water, smooth and oblivious. Officers passed with medals that still gleamed, wives with veils and gloves, aides with folders and schedules. No one stopped. No one noticed the old man standing still until someone did. Across the plaza, beneath a yellowing tree, stood Sophie. It had been more than 25 years since he'd seen her, not in photographs, not in memory, but truly seen her, standing in the flesh with eyes that hadn't aged the way the world had. Her hair was silver now, pinned up beneath a navy hat, and her coat was long and proper, but she looked at him with a softness he remembered too well, a softness that undid him in a single glance. She said nothing, neither did he, but then, slowly, she nodded, and John reached into his coat once more, this time for the letter, the fragile paper, still folded, still sealed. He held it in both hands like something sacred, like a relic. He looked toward the guards. He looked toward Sophie, and he knew he hadn't come to ask for permission. He had come to deliver the truth. Seated on a weather-worn bench just steps away from the chapel's white stone walls, where the funeral march inside played on with ceremonial precision and the slow cadence of military tradition, John Coslow let his gaze fall to the quiet gravel path beneath his feet. Around him, the air was thick with the scent of wet leaves and distant gunpowder. Not literally, no, but memory has a way of bleeding into the present. And for a man like John, there were scents, sounds, and sensations that had never really left. And as he sat there, fingers brushing the folded envelope inside his jacket, the world began to blur, not from tears, but from the deep pull of memory that demanded its due. He closed his eyes, and the chill of 1971 gave way to a winter far crueler. France, 1944, somewhere outside of Bastogne, where frost bit into the skin like knives and every breath felt like drawing smoke through ice. His unit had been pushing north, caught in the jaws of the Battle of the Bulge, where trees snapped from shellfire and the snow turned red, not from the sunset, but from what was left of men after the shells landed. It had been a war within a war, chaos inside chaos, and yet somehow he could remember every detail. General Nowak, not yet a general at the time, had been a colonel then, a field officer who refused to lead from maps and warm tents, who walked through the mud like the rest of them, shoulder to shoulder with the privates whose names he knew, whose hands he had shaken, whose deaths he had counted quietly at night. There was a cold night, colder than the rest, when their position had been compromised. Ambushed near the tree line, with snow above their knees and flares lighting the sky like false dawn. It was that night that changed everything. John had been injured, a fragment of mortar embedded in his shoulder, blood soaking into the wool of his overcoat. He was going into shock, trying to reload with shaking hands, when Nowak found him, crouched beside a broken wall, breathing shallow, whispering prayers he hadn't known he remembered. The colonel had pulled him behind a ridge, patched the wound with one hand, and handed him something with the other, a letter sealed and folded with John's name scrawled across it in blocky, hurried pencil. "If something happens to me," Nowak had said, not dramatic, not frightened, just tired in the way only men who've seen too much become, "you hold on to this, and if I don't make it out, you make sure it gets where it needs to go." At the time, John didn't ask questions. Orders were orders, and questions got people killed. He tucked the letter inside his uniform and focused on staying alive. He thought he'd hand it off after the battle, maybe even at the end of the war. But battles passed, and the war ended, and the letter never left his pocket, because Nowak didn't die. He was promoted instead, decorated, returned home to headlines and handshakes, to speeches in Congress and commendations in glossy frames. John saw his name once in a paper during the Eisenhower years, a brief mention during a televised interview, but they never spoke again. And John went back to Pennsylvania, to steel, to silence, to a room with a desk and a drawer where that envelope lay for 27 years, unopened, like a second wound that had never stopped bleeding beneath his skin. He didn't know why he never read it. Perhaps he didn't want to. Perhaps he was afraid it said too much, or not enough. He didn't write to Sophie, not after the war, not when he heard she'd married, not even when he'd learned she'd had a son. A boy who looked, according to someone's sister's letter, like someone she used to know. Time passed. The Cold War dawned. The country moved on. But the letter stayed. And now here he was, sitting outside the funeral of the man who had given him more than orders, more than salvation, a man who had entrusted him with a piece of himself, perhaps the most human part, and he had kept it. Not as a keepsake, not as a relic, but as a responsibility, a burden. John opened his eyes, pulled the envelope into his lap, and ran his thumb along the edge of the fold. The paper was thin now, delicate. Inside, the ink might have faded, the words might have blurred, but he didn't need to read it to know what it held. Not anymore. From the chapel, he could hear a trumpet begin to play, a slow, mournful version of taps that curled into the air like smoke from a long burned-out fire. He wondered, not for the first time, if it would be easier to just walk away, to let the memory stay buried, to let the sun never know. But the truth, however painful, has a way of demanding daylight. John stood up slowly, every joint protesting, every step heavy. He walked toward the side of the chapel where shadows stretched long across the lawn. The honor guard was preparing to fold the flag. The chaplain was reading the 23rd Psalm. The crowd was silent. He looked down at the letter in his hand, the envelope still sealed, but trembling slightly between his fingers, and knew with absolute certainty it was time. She stood just beyond the shadow of the chapel, not quite in view of the ceremonial line, not quite hidden, somewhere between memory and presence, like a ghost that had waited long enough to be seen, but not long enough to forget how much it had once felt. Sophie, wrapped in a dark wool coat, her hands gloved in brown leather, her hair pulled into a soft silver bun, stood with the poise of someone who had loved and lost, and chosen to carry both in silence. Her eyes, still sharp, still steady, had not left John Coslow since the moment he arrived. Even when the guards turned him away, even when the others ignored him, she had watched. And now, as he walked slowly toward the edge of the ceremony, envelope in hand, she stepped forward without hesitation. They hadn't seen each other in 27 years. No phone calls, no letters, no explanations, just time. Relentless, unkind, carving lines into their faces and distance into their lives. Yet here they were, two people on the edge of something neither one fully understood anymore, drawn together not by fate, but by the one man whose absence was being mourned only feet away. John stopped when he saw her. Not suddenly, but like a man slowing before a cliff's edge, uncertain whether he was meant to leap, to speak, or to fall apart right where he stood. His hands trembled not from age, but from the storm beneath his ribs. He opened his mouth as if to say her name, but Sophie raised a single hand, not to stop him, just to say gently, "Not yet." She stepped closer. There was a strange calm between them. Not peace, not quite, but something adjacent to it. Recognition, reverence, perhaps even forgiveness. "I knew you'd come," she said finally, her voice lower than he remembered, but just as clear. "He told me you would." John blinked. "Now, Ak," she nodded. Not in so many words, but he knew. In his last weeks, before the cancer took his voice, he told me there was someone who carried something meant for me, for him, for all of us. John looked down at the envelope in his hand, his fingers clutching it tighter than he realized. "I never opened it," he said. "I couldn't." Sophie gave a soft nod. "I know. That's why it matters." They stood there in silence, the kind of silence not filled with regret, but with truth. It wasn't anger in her eyes, it wasn't pain. It was something deeper, understanding born from time, from loss, from knowing that some stories don't end when people leave, but when truth finally arrives. She reached into her coat and pulled out a small photograph, black and white, its corners curled, its edges worn. She handed it to John without a word. And as he looked at the face in the photo, the jawline, the eyes, the uniform, he knew. He didn't need to ask. The young man in the picture wore an army officer's dress blues, his cap tilted slightly, his smile reserved, but in his eyes, John saw himself. "He's yours," Sophie said, her voice shaking just once, and then never again. "He doesn't know." John felt everything inside him drop into stillness. The air around them thickened, the ceremony behind them carried on, flag folding, final salutes, but none of it reached them here. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, but the question was softer than he expected, more wonder than accusation. Sophie looked away, her eyes drifting toward the horizon, where the trees along the cemetery grounds stood like witnesses. "I wanted to," she said. "After the war, I wrote the letter, I had the envelope, but you were gone. No address, no word. And by the time I found out you were alive, I was married. Victor, he wasn't the father, but he raised him as if he were, and I let it be that way." Because it was simpler, because I thought you had chosen silence. John shook his head slowly. I didn't choose silence. I chose not knowing what to say. They both stood there for a long time, not moving, not touching, just breathing in the same air after nearly 3 decades apart. The photograph was still in John's hand, the letter still in his pocket. He's in there now, she said, nodding toward the chapel. Front row. He was with Victor in his last hours. He helped write the eulogy. He believes he's mourning his father. John closed his eyes. Sophie continued. But Victor, he never lied to him. He just never told him everything. And when he knew the end was near, he said, if John comes, don't stop him. Let him speak. John opened his eyes. Does he want to know? She looked at him long and full. He deserves to. John nodded, though it wasn't so much a decision as it was a surrender, not to fear, but to something stronger. Duty, not military duty, not the kind found in rank or orders, but the duty of a man who has carried a secret long enough. The duty of a father who finally understands the cost of silence. I need to go in, he said. Sophie reached out and gently touched his shoulder, the way she might have all those years ago, before the train left the station, before Europe, before the war. Then go, she whispered. He's waiting. John took a breath, not shallow, not forced, but full, and stepped toward the chapel doors. The old post chapel was hushed in the way only a military funeral could be, reverent, orderly, impeccably choreographed. Every sound echoed with ceremony. The slow march of boots across polished marble, the rustling of uniforms as soldiers stood at attention, the soft click of medals against breastplates. The stained glass windows filtered the October light into blue and gold patterns that danced across the wooden pews, and at the front of the room, under the American flag and the somber gaze of portraits past, stood the casket of General William Nowak. It was a scene built for honor. Speeches by commanding officers, eulogies delivered with clipped dignity, the slow, deliberate folding of the flag, the words, for faithful service to a grateful nation, repeated like gospel. But beneath it all, under the protocol and perfection, was something unfinished, something unsaid. A truth still outside, walking through the side doors, with a letter in his coat pocket and a promise to fulfill. John Coslow stepped into the chapel quietly, not disrupting the rhythm, not rushing the moment, simply entering with the weight of 30 years in his shoulders and the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Sophie remained at the threshold. This was his path alone now. Eyes turned toward him, some in confusion, others in faint recognition. A few whispered. One officer in the front row stiffened, clearly displeased at the unscheduled intrusion, but no one moved to stop him. And then, from the second row, a tall figure in full dress uniform, with strong shoulders and a face that mirrored John's in too many ways, stood up. Marek, the young officer, the son who had buried a father he never fully knew. He looked directly at John, not with anger, not with defense, but with a question. That was when the silence broke, not from chaos, not from protest, but from Colonel James Hartley, seated 3 rows back, a Vietnam veteran with silver hair and eyes that had seen more than most would ever understand. Slowly, deliberately, the colonel stood. "If I may," he said, voice carrying with the firm clarity of someone who had once commanded men under fire, "I believe this gentleman has something important to say. And I believe the general would have wanted him to say it here, now." The presiding officer hesitated, looked at the colonel, then at John, then gave a subtle nod. John stepped forward. He didn't walk to the pulpit. He didn't raise his voice. He stood beside the casket, removed his cap, and pulled the envelope from his coat. His hands didn't tremble now. "This letter," he said, his voice deep and steady, "was given to me by Colonel Nowak in 1944, before he was promoted, before he became the man we're laying to rest today. He told me to carry it. He told me to deliver it only if he never made it back. He did make it back, but some truths don't know time." He unfolded the letter. The paper crackled. The ink was faded but still legible. "I was never brave enough to read it until last night," John continued. "I thought it wasn't mine to open, but now I know it was always mine to carry, and yours to hear." He began to read. "Sophie, if this letter finds you, I am likely dead. I don't know what I'll be remembered for, maybe for medals, maybe for rank, maybe for surviving when better men did not. But I hope, in some small way, you remember me for the way I once loved you. I know I lost that, and I know why. I wasn't man enough to face the truth, and I let someone else carry what I should have. Our son, your son, is not mine in name, but he is mine in blood. And though I was never the father he deserved, I hope one day, when he knows the truth, he will understand. If John is reading this, then I know he kept the promise. I know he came back, and I know he forgave me. That's all I ever wanted." When John finished, he looked out over the chapel. No one spoke. Sophie was standing now, eyes wet, unmoving. Marek remained frozen, lips slightly parted, jaw tight, fists clenched, not in rage but in reckoning. The truth had entered him like a slow wave, overwhelming, impossible to deny. He stepped forward, closer to John, closer to the man who had just read the words of the only father he'd ever known, and revealed the one he never had. John lowered the letter, looked at him. "I didn't know," John said softly, "not until it was too late, but I'm here now, and if that matters." Marek didn't answer with words. He stepped forward, closed the distance, and extended his hand, firm, deliberate, not as a soldier to a superior, not as a stranger to a man, but as a son reaching out for something he had never dared hope existed. John took it. The chapel, still silent, exhaled. No more speeches were given, no more honors recited, but something far more sacred had happened. In that space between war and peace, between orders and confessions, between fathers and sons, the truth had found its voice. And in its echo, there was something resembling forgiveness. The ceremony ended without a final hymn, not because it was forgotten, but because it was no longer needed. What had taken place in that chapel, under the silent gaze of stained glass saints and the muted light of an October sky, went beyond tradition, beyond ritual, beyond even honor. It was the kind of moment rarely spoken of in military history, not a battle, not a victory, but a quiet reconciliation, born not from orders or obligation, but from truth, raw and unapologetic. When the crowd began to file out, John Koslow remained near the casket for a few moments longer, his cap in hand, the now opened letter tucked back into his breast pocket, no longer a burden, but something else entirely, a witness. A piece of himself returned, a voice no longer silenced by fear or protocol. He didn't look around for approval. He didn't wait to be thanked. That had never been his purpose. He had come to deliver something that belonged to the living, not to the dead, a truth that had waited through decades of silence, folded in the dark, guarded by memory, and finally spoken when it could no longer be denied. Outside the chapel, the wind had shifted. The clouds had thinned, letting a fragile beam of sunlight stretch across the cemetery, casting soft light on the rows of white markers that stood in silence, like an audience long dismissed. Sophie stood by the path, her hands wrapped tightly in front of her, eyes on John as he approached, not expectantly, not with hope, but with something more grounded, quiet recognition. She didn't speak right away, neither did he. Then, gently, she asked, "Do you regret opening it?" John shook his head. "No, I regret waiting so long." Sophie nodded, her face unreadable but not cold. There was something between them now that hadn't existed before, not the memory of what had been, but the shared truth of what had always lingered beneath the surface. In some other life, they might have mourned what they lost, but here, now, it was enough to know they had found what was true. Marek stood nearby, speaking quietly with one of the attending officers, the letter still on his mind, the truth settling into him like new armor. He glanced over at John once, and their eyes met. No words exchanged, but something understood. "We are not strangers anymore," John walked toward the gate slowly, his steps lighter now, not in body but in spirit. For so long, the letter had been a weight, a sealed memory, a hidden shame, a question he was too afraid to ask. But now it was part of him, not as a secret but as something spoken, witnessed and released. He paused once on the path, not to look back, but to breathe. The kind of breath that reaches deeper than lungs, the kind that fills the soul. In his chest, the echo of gunfire was quieter now. The letter, finally opened, had not undone the past, but it had rewritten what it meant. And as he stepped out of Arlington's gates, past the stone lions and manicured hedges, past the people who did not know him and never would, he understood something simple and profound. It is never too late to be honest, never too late to speak, never too late to stand for something that only you remember, especially when that memory has the power to heal. He didn't take the metro. He didn't hail a cab. He just walked, the city unfolding in front of him like a place he hadn't truly seen in years, because now, at last, the burden was not his alone. It belonged to all of them, to Sophie, to Marek, to the general, and to every man who ever carried something unspoken for too long. And as the sun slipped past the rooftops, casting gold against the Capitol dome, John Koslow walked on, not toward war or memory or medals, but toward peace. We share new stories every day, real stories that touch, move, and stay with you. If this one meant something to you, leave a comment and subscribe. We'd love to hear your thoughts.